What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a good week. So there have been a lot of updates to SteamOS in the last 3 weeks alone. And to say the least, it's been a roller coaster ride for me in terms of the new Proton 7.0-6 and how it's adapting to newer titles and newer SteamOS versions. And as far as that's going, I'm having a harder and harder time trusting the new SteamOS updates and also the new Proton versions, at least the mainline Proton versions that Valve is releasing. And I'm not releasing this video trying to state to not oblige to Valve's new updates or not to trust Steam Deck or anything like that. I'm simply stating a fact that Valve is slipping when it comes to the newer Proton versions, and it seems like their accountability is at an all-time low. Because since Resident Evil 4 Remake came out, it seems like Valve hastily released a new SteamOS update, as well as updates to Proton Hotfix, Experimental, and 7.0-6. And for the most part, those new updates, in order to play Resident Evil 4 Remake, seem to have broken a lot of my favorite games when it comes to the mainline Proton and how it operates with them. Games like Prototype 2, which worked from day one, seem to crash every 2 minutes and has become virtually unplayable. Now, that is one of my favorite games, so I do play it every week, but ever since Resident Evil 4 Remake came out, I've been playing it less, but also since it came out, there has been a new update to Proton and SteamOS, and ironically enough, one of my favorite games do not work now because of that, so I switched over to Proton GE 7-50, and it pretty much works perfect, just like Resident Evil 4 Remake does when I enable Proton GE 7-50 to that game too. But Prototype 2 isn't the only game not working. Resident Evil 3, which has just recently become playable, it doesn't crash, but the frame rate is pretty much terrible on the base Proton 7.0-6. It goes around 35 to 45 FPS, and it just keeps dipping around those numbers, even in isolated locations like the sewer levels. It just seems like a lot of titles have become more stuttery since this new SteamOS update. And I get they're going to fix it eventually, but the accountability of impulse updating Proton and SteamOS in order to play something that's new and hot, opposed to taking care of their older titles and making sure they work and taking care of their customers for the future and the past. But it seems like sometimes Valve is just interested in getting the publicity of being able to play newer titles when it sacrifices the playability of around 50% of the older titles. And I see so many reports and conversations on Steam about this, and I have released multiple posts notifying Valve that some games, even though they say they're playable and verified, aren't working properly with the new Proton version. And for the most part, I don't think Valve has seen my post or any other post because they're just interested in what's new and popular. And I get Resident Evil 4 Remake is probably going to be Game of the Year, and so they really need that game to work. But sometimes it seems with the verification system, Valve only pays attention to the popular titles and not the smaller ones like Prototype 2, Resident Evil 3. But here's where that theory dies. I've been having trouble with Marvel's Spider-Man with the base Proton. There have been stuttering issues, and it crashed on me a few times with the base Proton. So guess what? I switched over to Proton GE 7-50, and everything seemed to work perfectly fine. In fact, the frame rate went up to a steady 45 FPS, and the FSR 2.1 is pretty much perfect, and the resolution looks native with GE 7-50. So having extremely popular titles like Marvel's Spider-Man not working with the main Proton 7.0-6 kind of set off a red flag for me and enabled me to try to make a video just to let them know that their accountability system and their priorities should be on all of the games before they release a Proton version. And I get having those games work for Steam Deck will ultimately improve sales for the Steam Deck and the game, but I don't want them to rush out some kind of preview or beta-esque update in order to satisfy the people that can't wait a few weeks. But while Valve has been doing that, the Proton GE community has been just releasing bangers left and right, with Proton GE 7-50 coming out a few months ago and still working pretty much perfect with Resident Evil 4 Remake, which just came out last week. It is incredible to me, and it's probably the most impressive software on the platform right now. I use Proton GE 7-50 with all of my favorite games because I trust it a whole lot more than Valve's consistent updates with inconsistent performance. And right now I'm playing Resident Evil 3 with Proton GE 7-50, and it's going a perfect 60 FPS when I bring it down to 900p. And for the most part, GE 7-50 has been consistent, and I cannot say the same for Valve's mainline Proton. It just seems like they're all over the place with their different versions and fallbacks. It just seems like they need more people working on it with more skill, like the people working on GE. They seem to have it down. I also enable that Proton GE version with Marvel Spider-Man, and it runs buttery smooth with that. So I don't know if you all are going through the same thing with the main Proton, just suddenly and randomly not working with your favorite titles. But there's a ton more games that aren't compatible with it at its current state. And this continues to be an issue. I turn on my Steam Deck, I switch off the compatibility from Proton GE to the normal Proton, and something always goes wrong. Or I just play a game that was supposed to work because it was verified just a few months ago, but it seems after every popular game comes out, there's some kind of mess up with the main Proton. And Valve really needs to get this under control because it's hurting their reliability and verification system. And I get some people aren't smart enough to figure out that Proton GE 7-50 is also available, and most people, I guess, wouldn't want to go to desktop mode and download it, even though most people have Surface Pros and MacBooks. So I don't understand why they wouldn't be smart enough to go into desktop mode and figure this out themselves. It's not like I'm Sheldon from Big Bang Theory or something. And what I'm pretty much trying to say is Proton can just release an actual stable version of SteamOS a few weeks or even months down the line, as long as that means that everything that came before will be just as stable. And for the meantime, people can just use Proton GE to play their games. Because even though SteamOS updates and it tells you all the changes, there isn't exactly a big announcement telling you that if you switch your compatibility to the main Proton, that your games will be just as stable with the main Proton like they were with alternatives like GE. It just seems like Valve is a little shy when it comes to releasing a new Proton version. And it also seems like accountability is at an all-time low, and I can't help but cringe a little bit when a new SteamOS update comes out. And sure, my favorite games not being able to play and switching to Proton GE isn't the worst, but with the latest SteamOS, I have lost 4,000 non-Steam games because for some reason, the new Proton version is not compatible with plugins. I haven't been able to fix it since the new SteamOS update for Resident Evil 4 Remake. So as good as Remake is, I lost countless emulated titles, and seeing all of them gone from the categories and not being able to save anything to the categories or collections was just the worst feeling. Looking at all the work I did for this past year just being erased by Valve's new SteamOS stable update. It's insane because I didn't think that third-party stuff like the ROM manager and emulators would be affected by SteamOS, but it seems like Valve has gotten so impulsive to the point that they'll damage even plugins. And ironically enough, plugins are damaged, right? But the theme point system has officially released on Valve's Steam Point Store. So now you can have different startup animations, but for some reason, plugins are just not working correctly. And I feel like that's not a coincidence. They broke the plugins, breaking ROM Manager, and flushing 4,000 non-Steam games, categorized, named, with custom artwork handpicked by me for an entire year, just because they had an impulse to semi-fix a new popular title. This is the reason why it's going to be really hard for me to trust Valve's new SteamOS updates. And I know, first world complaining, but that's a lot of work. I looked at almost every single one of those emulated titles, and I had them categorized. I had other categories on top of that, like Resident Evil collections with all of the classics. Everything was perfectly categorized. And then one day, after the SteamOS update showed up and the plugin wasn't working, I didn't think that it would be completely damaged to the point I couldn't mess with ROM Manager. But it seemed like ROM Manager just didn't recognize anything. And so it went as far as to delete all my non-Steam games to the point I had 0 from 4,000. And then on top of that, while messing with the settings and trying to recover anything, I ended up deleting all of the custom pictures as well. But I managed to get that back. I didn't think of backing up the grid files, which are the custom artworks, but after that I sure did. But I also didn't know how to back up the non-Steam games. So that was at a total loss, and you bet your ass I'm not going to mess with ROM Manager ever again as long as this SteamOS update keeps notifying me that Decky Share or something or another had an error and it can't be read at the moment. I'm not sure what that notification means. I've looked it up and there seems to be no fixes for it. And you can rely on me for trying to get 4,000 non-Steam games back. And most of them were emulated, so I didn't lose the games, but I did lose the categories and I lost all of the work I put into it. The games aren't lost, I would still have to go into EmuDeck, even though EmuDeck seems to be broken without certain SD cards that I installed it into. And I read online that you can install EmuDeck on each SD card, but EmuDeck just doesn't work when I do that. It only works with one SD card, which is the first SD card I installed EmuDeck to. So that's pretty much broken. So I really never ever going to trust the SteamOS with my emulations and non-Steam games, because it seems like it can't handle about 4,000 non-Steam games, which is understandable, but it either reached its limit with over 4,000. I think I had almost 5,000, or the new SteamOS broke it, which by the constant notification I get every time I start it up, it seems very likely. And once again, this happened because of very, very low accountability and care that Valve is starting to have for their new SteamOS updates. And it seems like this is a trend with Valve. They just try to update something as much as possible and then forget about it, or they break it and forget about it. And this is what everybody was fearing, that the Steam Deck would get pushed too far and Valve would just rage quit. And I'm sure they're not going to quit for a long time, but with this major mess up, it seems like it might be the start to something not so favorable, which is low accountability. So yeah, did anybody else get their non-Steam games completely wiped from the categories? Are you able to get ROM Manager to work? Because I'm just never going back to it. I deleted it and hid it from myself just so I can have my non-Steam games stay in my Steam library in peace. And with the lower FPS and constant crashing on my favorite titles, it seems like Valve has really messed up with this one. Resident Evil 4 Remake is still not working great, so I don't know what they fixed with it. It just doesn't run at 20 FPS like it used to from day one. But the game still comes up with that message saying that Resident Evil has crashed and we're very sorry for the inconvenience. That still pops up sometimes for me with the base Proton. But it seems like Proton GE is picking up all the pieces. And I really hope Valve interacts with them more and gets some pointers, because it seems like they really don't know what they're doing. And I'm not scared to say that because I have the right to. I lost 4,000 non-Steam games. But surprisingly enough, losing all of those non-Steam games was the first strike. And then a bunch of other games that weren't working properly. And also, for some reason, when I don't have a specific SD card in, it still shows the games I had installed. And I've never seen that glitch before, where games are ghosted into my library. So you have that glitch going on, where when you remove an SD card, the games don't disappear. So it's kind of hard to keep track what you have installed in a specific SD card. Sometimes there's just so many different types of glitches that the Steam Deck has had, and I never really made a video to point this out, but I think these humongous glitches that I've experienced in the past few weeks kind of more than justifies this video. So just beware if you want to update SteamOS in order to get a popular title like Resident Evil 4 Remake or Dead Space to work. Just know that Valve is still having issues with Diablo 4, and Proton GE seems to have fixed that before Valve could. So before you get a new, completely unstable, even though they call it stable, SteamOS update, just look into Proton GE and the newer versions like 7-50 before you jump to this new commitment that Valve is presenting to you. Updating Valve's SteamOS is like getting married to someone who's from a foreign country. They promise you so many things, but you really don't know what to expect, and you're locked into it. You can't go back to previous SteamOS updates, and they should make that an option. And I'm here to say, Valve, please make the option to go back to previous SteamOS updates. The fact that they just wipe it clean and say, this is the new one, the old one never existed, and this is the only option you have, is just wrong to me. But with Proton GE, they have countless versions that you can go back to, so you have options there. So yeah, I've been, as of recent, dealing with some SteamOS BS, but thankfully, Proton GE has saved the day over and over and over and over again. It hasn't solved the EmuDeck issue that I'm dealing with, which pretty much makes it inoperable, and I have to make the shortcuts myself for specific titles that I want on my internal memory, like the old Resident Evil games. But I'm never going to use ROM Manager ever again, because SteamOS just seems to hate it, and it messes with other non-Steam games that aren't even part of my emulation collection. And I know how to work ROM Manager. I've been working with it the entire year, and I'm pretty much an expert at it. And I did everything that I usually did, but the only difference was SteamOS this time, unfortunately. So yeah, a moment of silence in the comment section for my 4,000 non-Steam games. that I worked so hard to organize, and a lot of those, if not about 300 of those to 500 of those shortcuts, were personally made by me. So that is about 30 hours of work at least that was erased just because Valve had some kind of impulse buy effect for Resident Evil 4 Remake. So as much as I love that game, it signifies me losing a ton of progress for this entire year. So yeah, that's about all I have to say about this new SteamOS update. When the new one comes, may God help us all, because I don't know what I'm going to do if it deletes the non-Steam games that I've made so far, which are about 50. Even what happened recently, I don't think I'm ever going to recover from it, honestly. Just imagine if you make a ton of shortcuts on your Windows computer or Mac computer for specific programs and customizations to all those programs, and then Windows just updates one day and it just deletes all of them. Not even Windows has done that. That's saying a lot. Valve has successfully made Windows look more reliable with these unstable updates that they've been releasing. And this is coming from somebody who's ditched Windows for this SteamOS. I guess the statement of you can't speak too soon is never too late to say with any company as much as you trust them. And yeah, if you see this video, just know that I did release a lot of bug reports about this on the official Steam website. I am not quiet about this. And if you see this video, if you're going through the same thing, if you've lost a lot of emulation and just don't know how to handle it and it feels like your world is going to end or something because of all that work that you lost recently, don't hesitate to let Valve know. If there's 1,000 of you that see this video and are going through the same thing, I want all of you to pull a Resident Evil fan base and harass Valve to fix this issue. But that's only if you're going through it, because I think it is justifiable to notify a company if they've messed up this much. And this is pretty much the biggest mess up I've seen SteamOS have, among other smaller ones, which have never lasted this long. This new SteamOS so far has taken almost 2 weeks to fix. And in my opinion, they should have taken the initial 2 weeks to release it. And they shouldn't pull another CD Projekt Red with their next SteamOS update. And yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments below about all this SteamOS update drama. And just a word of advice, if you're going to mess with EmuDeck, don't make shortcuts, because there's a big chance that you're just going to lose that with the new SteamOS update for some reason. If you're going to make shortcuts, just make shortcuts of your favorite ones, and preferably emulated titles that are already installed in your internal memory, like I'm going to do, so I just won't lose track of them. So yeah, kind of a low energy video, but this is something that happened a few weeks ago. I was going to talk about it right away, but I didn't want to take the hype away from Resident Evil 4 Remake, at least for myself. So I wanted to leave all the gloomy crap for later. But yeah, I don't trust SteamOS anymore. And I hope you guys have a good one. Later.